Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be able to be here to give this talk and to see so many of you here to hear it. Of all the many doctrines and moral teachings of the Church, it seems to be the teachings on the ethics of the beginning and end of life that are given pretty much the most attention by the media and by wider society. In fact, they're given so much attention that you'd be forgiven for thinking that the teaching on, say, abortion and euthanasia are pretty much the only doctrines that the Church has, except, of course, the teachings on sex. But more about those in 2 weeks' time. Although almost everyone knows that the Church teaches that abortion and euthanasia are wrong, when this is brought up in the media, the reasons behind these teachings are very rarely given. So what I'd like to do in the next half hour is to take a chance, as it were, to put the record straight. I shall attempt to take a closer look at how the Church understands the beginning and end of life, before going on in each case to look at the moral implications of this understanding. I also hope that I'll be able to show that Church teaching makes sense from a theological, biological, and philosophical point of view. Now, of course, it's not possible to cover everything in half an hour, but hopefully I'll present just enough to stimulate thought and questions. Now, I'm also very keenly aware that beginning and end-of-life issues are difficult topics to talk about because they so often touch on areas of painful personal experience. My own experience of this topic is not simply as an aspiring bioethicist and moral theologian, but also as a pastor who has experienced the human difficulties at the heart of these issues. And of course, as a human being who has experienced the loss of friends and family. I'd like to start my consideration of the beginning of life by briefly placing it within a theological framework. At the start of the Bible, in the story of creation, we read, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our own image, after our own likeness.' So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." And it's this being in the image of God that gives each human being a special dignity. This dignity is not based on anything we do, but based simply on the fact of what we are. We are human beings. This story of creation also reminds us that whoever we are, whoever our parents are, that ultimately it is God who is the author of human life. So human life has inherent dignity and value given to it by God. Of course, this view of human life is something which has moral implications, and these are picked up and treated directly by the earliest theologians and writers in the Church. For example, the writer of the Didache, Tertullian, St. Augustine, and of course many others. And what they do is they specifically state that the value and dignity of human life applies not only to those who have been born, but also to the developing human being in the womb. They taught that acts which harm or kill an unborn human, such as abortion, are grave acts. Now, this position has continued to be stated at various points throughout Church history, including in Vatican II's Gaudium et Spes, and also if we look at the recent speeches of Pope Francis, we see it again reiterated there. Church teaching on the inherent value of human life, including life in the womb, is clearly and consistently stated. Now here it's important to note that in cases where someone has had an abortion, the Church also clearly and consistently preaches the possibility of a way forward through the healing power of God's mercy. One of the things that's often said about the Church's view on the status of the unborn and the morality of the abortion is that it specifically requires a theological framework. So what I want to do now is to look at the issue from a biological and then a philosophical point of view, hopefully showing that the Church's teaching on the beginning of life is defendable and coherent outside that theological framework. From a biological perspective, it's pretty uncontroversial to suggest that the life of a new human being begins at the moment of fertilization. What happens, as you know, at fertilization is that a single sperm penetrates the ovum, the egg. Now, both of these so-called gamete cells make a vital biological genetic contribution, since each has a complement of 23 chromosomes. When fusion happens, the result is a new single individual cell, which has a total of 46 chromosomes. Now, although the new cell, often called a zygote, has half its genetic material from the mother and half from the father, it's genetically distinct from both of them. It's a unique individual. Once fertilization is complete, all the genetic information that is needed for development is in place. Not just what is required for development into an embryo and then into a differentiated fetus, but everything that is genetically and developmentally necessary to direct growth, development, repair, in fact, everything that's necessary for day-to-day function for a whole human lifespan. Biologically speaking, from the moment I came into existence at fertilization, I was equipped with what I needed to exist and function as a 14-day-old embryo, as a 2-year-old child exploring my environment, as a 36-year-old Dominican friar, and everything that I'll need for as long as I live. Now, it seems to me that the fact that there is continuous, self-directed development of a human being from the moment of fertilization through until death is very significant. Significant because it's a continuous story of the existence of a single human being which can be traced. The fact that early human development takes place away from direct observation, and the fact that at the earliest stages this new human being doesn't look like a developed child, should not distract us from the reality of what that small group of cells is: a unique individual human being worthy of protection. To deliberately destroy or tamper with such an individual is to destroy or tamper with the life of a unique human being. Yet many people would claim that in these early stages, a human being has no moral status, so therefore no right to life or right to protection. The common way of expressing this is as follows: the human zygote, embryo, fetus is indeed a human being, but it's not a human person. And it's personhood which gives moral status, and with it the right to life and to protection. The reason why, according to this view, an early stage human being is not a person is usually argued along these lines. This individual isn't seemingly able to feel pain, to be conscious, to think or desire, or do any of the things that one might say a person should be able to do. So personhood, according to this view, is based on certain characteristics that a human being has. Now, different scholars come up with different ideas for what constitutes personhood, and therefore there are different accounts of when personhood begins. Some link personhood to the development of a rudimentary nervous system, when the fetus might be able to feel some pain. Others link personhood to the development of certain reflexes, and others to a much greater level of self-awareness, which comes perhaps even weeks after birth. Now, that view of personhood allows for the possibility that infanticide is morally permissible. Effectively, this way of thinking casts the embryo and the fetus as non-person humans that may develop with time into actual human persons. But until such development has taken place, a human doesn't enjoy the moral status and the rights that go with it. Now, if we think about this idea of personhood for a moment, we start to see that it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Looking through the literature, we will find that there's a range of different accounts of when personhood begins, and so when moral status begins. And this does rather suggest that any criteria we might wish to give in this kind of argument are at best arbitrary and unsatisfactory. We need only look back a relatively short distance in human history to see that there were, at various times, ideas of personhood which centered on race, sex, skin color, and things like that. And they've all been exposed quite rightly for what they are: threats to the fundamental equality and dignity of all human beings. Now, surely linking personhood to any set of attributes is to make a similar mistake. The only difference is the set of prejudices which are used to create those characteristics. Furthermore, this account of personhood relies on the fact that it is something which is gained. But we can also see that by these criteria, personhood might also be something that we could lose. So if we equate personhood with, say, self-awareness or consciousness, does that mean that we stop being a person if we're asleep or under an anesthetic? Now, I know that sounds like a rather silly suggestion, but if we apply this version of personhood consistently, that's certainly what we should think. And more seriously and importantly, what of people who suffer brain injuries or have serious Alzheimer's? Are they also non-persons who don't enjoy moral status and the protection that goes with it? If so, those who are already vulnerable because of injury or disability would be discriminated against. So I think this set of problems suggests that a more robust and inclusive and just view of personhood is needed. So how do we come up with such a view? Well, perhaps we should think that personhood is to do with what we are rather than what we do. Now, if we recast personhood in these terms, then we can see that personhood is at the very heart of what it is to be a human being, something that's intrinsic to human nature. And so features of human life, such as consciousness, self-awareness, thinking, desiring, and so on, are functions which come from the fact that we are a human person, with a nature that makes it possible for us to function in that way. Now, it's true that a human person at the very earliest stage of its development can't have the capacities of an adult person, but it is of a human's very nature to grow and develop into a person who will exhibit these capacities. Now, hopefully you can see from what I've said that this view of human personhood doesn't discriminate. It gives moral status to each and every human being from the moment of their existence, and it does so because of what they are rather than because of what they do. Holding the view of personhood I've just put forward has moral implications, most obviously in the area of abortion. Abortion, according to this view, we might say is wrong, precisely because it brings about the end of the life of a human person, a person with the right to life, a right to protection from harm, and a right to be allowed to develop, to express those fundamental human capacities and flourish. It also has implications for any technological or experimental interventions which are likely to have an effect on the integrity and well-being of any human person. An example might be the production and destruction of embryos for the purposes of obtaining embryonic stem cells for use in research and medicine. There is no doubt, in my mind at least, that most of the time the goals that are being pursued by researchers and medics in these cases are good. They're working to understand fundamental questions of human development and disease. But because these noble goals are pursued at the expense of the destruction of human life, the interventions are morally wrong. After that all too brief introduction to the theological, biological, and philosophical aspects of the beginning of life, I want to turn to look at the end of life. Just as we have a concrete moment in which we come to be, come to exist, there is also a moment when we will die. Now, for most people, this fact isn't especially cheery, even if we do have faith that death isn't the end. What happens at death is the disintegration of the human person, the separation of body and soul. In the Dominican tradition, our great intellectual figure, St. Thomas Aquinas, taught that each human being is a unity of body and soul, by which he meant a body organized, given life, and integrated by a soul. For Thomas, this unity of body and soul is what we are, and what allows us to function as human beings. And so he sees the death of the human person as something unnatural, and he suggests that it's a consequence of original sin. We die, we are mortal, because we are fallen creatures. Now this in itself gives us a way of understanding death theologically, which I'm pretty sure would resonate with a lot of our experience. All of us who've suffered the loss of loved ones should be able to identify something in this account. It's hard to watch someone die, and the void which we are left with after they have died can be very, very difficult indeed. We mourn, we grieve, because we have lost someone we loved who was unique and cannot be replaced. But it is in this very tragedy, a tragedy of sin and death, which Christ, in his passion, death, and resurrection, has come to save us from. Christian hope teaches us that God doesn't simply allow our annihilation, but brings about the defeat of death, so that we can be ultimately restored, glorified body and soul on the last day. Death, then, needn't have the final word. Now, it's pretty obvious from our own experiences with our loved ones, and of course with our own regard to our own death, that there is much that we have to come to terms with at the end of life. We may have a fear of pain and suffering, the fear of loss of dignity, the loss of control and independence, and so on. But the Christian account of death and dying places all these things in the context of hope, the hope of eternal life in the presence of God, something which you will have heard a lot about last week in Father Richard's fine talk. So what I want to do now is focus on the various moral issues that come up at the end of life and try and give you a sense of how we might navigate through them. At the point where it's clear that a person's condition is terminal, there is quite rightly a shift in focus in medical and nursing care, away from cure of the underlying disease towards the management of pain and symptoms, towards palliative care. At this stage, many people are understandably concerned about medication and treatments, their nature and effects, which intervention should be accepted and which should be refused, and whether or not treatment can be withdrawn under certain circumstances. The Catholic position on end-of-life pain management is relatively straightforward. There is no moral problem with providing good, sensible pain management for people at the end of life. The thing to be aware about the use of pain-relieving drugs such as diamorphine is that they can lead to two distinct effects. The first effect is that they relieve pain. However, because of the way that such drugs work, there can sometimes be a suppression of the heart rate and of breathing rate, which in some cases may also hasten death. Now, the Church, from the times of our own beloved St. Thomas onwards, has developed a way of approaching actions which have two effects, one which is desired and one which is not desired. It's become known as the principle or doctrine of double effect. The principle states that if we have an action which has two effects, one which is good, which is desired, and another effect which is bad and undesired, it is morally permissible to carry out that action, provided we don't intend the bad effect. Let me give a real example. We might give someone morphine to relieve pain at the end of their life. Because that person is weak, it may also slightly shorten that person's life. Provided we are giving the person morphine because our intention is to relieve pain, and that we are giving the appropriate dose for that purpose, it's morally permissible to do so. The shortening of the person's life is a side effect which is not part of our intention. However, if we were to give them morphine because we wanted to shorten their life, then this would be an act against the good of that person's life, an act of euthanasia, something I'll return to later on. Another issue that comes up at the end of life is the question of whether or not it's permissible to stop or refuse to have certain treatments. Now here, there's another possible misconception, and it's that Catholics hold that absolutely everything must be done to sustain the life of a person in all circumstances. And this simply isn't the case. As I already mentioned at the beginning of this talk, the Catholic Church affirms that life is a gift from God, and therefore we should care for all human life. But when death is inevitable, we should strive to accept it and prepare for it, not to deny this inevitability. In order to help us make good decisions at the end of life in regard to the treatment and care we receive, the Church has developed an important distinction between ordinary and extraordinary means of preserving life. And we are only obliged to use ordinary means of preserving life. Now, what constitutes ordinary means can't simply be set down in a list of treatments or procedures. The distinction between what is ordinary and extraordinary comes out in the individual circumstances of each patient, taking into consideration the specific circumstances of their case. In clarifying this very issue, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith has said that in assessing whether or not treatment is ordinary or extraordinary, the following should be considered: the type of treatment to be used, its degree of complexity or risk, its cost, and the possibilities of using it. And it also goes on, take account also of the state of the sick person and his or her physical or moral resources. So it's not a cookie-cutter solution, but rather something which looks at the burdens and benefits of treatments for a particular person. Perhaps, again, it would be better if I illustrated this with an example. A man in his early 20s, with access to a major British city hospital, who has otherwise been in good health, is diagnosed with a form of cancer. The cancer is localized to a particular organ and has not spread. It would be reasonable to assume under such circumstances that a course of chemotherapy would be ordinary means of preserving life. Now, it's true the treatment will involve burdens and difficulties for this person, but the benefits of that treatment are clear. They offer the man a good chance of going into remission and probably many years of healthy life afterwards. The person is otherwise of sound mind and sound body, and so it would seem perfectly reasonable to expect him to undertake the course of chemotherapy. Consider another case, another man in his 20s who has returned to hospital and has been diagnosed with a recurrence of his cancer. The first time, the cancer had been localized to a particular organ, and he was given chemotherapy. However, on return, it is clear that the cancer has spread throughout his whole body, and the diagnosis is that it is terminal. He is very weak and frail because of the cancer, and he is confined to his bed. Because of his condition, chemotherapy would clearly be very burdensome, and would at best allow him to live for a month or two longer. So it should be considered extraordinary means of preserving life. Now, that's not to say that it is wrong for this man to ask to be treated. He might have very good reasons why he would like to receive treatment, even though it only means he will live a short while longer. He might want to have the time to see people, to enjoy moments such as a relative's birthday, and so on. He can accept that treatment quite freely. He can ask for it quite freely. However, he shouldn't feel that he's morally obliged to have that treatment. Now, last of all, I'd like to consider the topic of euthanasia. Now, it might help us to start with a definition, and the kind of euthanasia I want to focus on is voluntary euthanasia, which we might define as an act or omission which deliberately brings about the end of a person's life in order to relieve their suffering. And it's an act that is carried out at the request of the person who is suffering. Now, the first thing to note there is that euthanasia is very different from withholding or withdrawing extraordinary means of preserving life, or indeed very different from a side effect of pain medication. Euthanasia, rather than simply allowing a person to die or accepting an undesired shortening of life as a consequence of pain medication, involves a deliberate intention to end a person's life. I think it's very important to say that people who request euthanasia or, say, assisted suicide, they always make this request when they are suffering a great deal and they've reached the point where they feel they can't go on. Or alternatively, it's made by a person perhaps who's received a diagnosis of a terminal disease, which means that there will be a good deal of pain and suffering at some future point. I'm sure all of us can see or perhaps have experienced the human difficulties in these situations. The Church sees the act of euthanasia as something against the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. In encyclical Evangelium Vitae, Pope John Paul II states, this doctrine is based upon the natural law and upon the written word of God, and is transmitted by the Church's tradition. So natural law and the written word of God. And that should show us that the idea that euthanasia is morally wrong is not something we can know just from revelation or from the tradition of the Church, but something that we can know for use of reason alone. Now, I wish to turn very briefly to some arguments which might be put forward in support of euthanasia, and then provide rather brief responses to them. The first argument is one that to some extent I've already alluded to. It goes like this: when people are suffering greatly at the end of life, euthanasia is a compassionate way to bring that suffering to an end. After all, it's the kind of thing that we are willing to do for domestic animals and livestock, so why not for people too? Now, this argument makes some intuitive sense at first glance. However, I think the problem with it is that it doesn't do justice to the proper meaning of compassion. To be compassionate is to suffer with a person. And this suggests to me that the best way to show compassion is to be willing to accompany those who struggle and suffer as they are dying. And this means, of course, providing medication and basic human care, which can go a long way to relieving suffering. And of course, it means good communication, giving time for a person to express their fears and anxieties and do what can be done to help the person at every level. Unlike animals, people have the ability to express their suffering and to come to some sort of understanding of what is happening to them. Compassion surely can't be true compassion if a person's life is extinguished. An important part of compassion, though, is to strive to constantly improve medication and care protocols so that pain and suffering can be further relieved. A second argument in favour of euthanasia is often stated in terms of autonomy. Just to put it briefly, each and every person is autonomous and so is free to make decisions about the shape and direction of their lives. Why not also then allow people to make decisions about the manner, timing and nature of their death, including the decision to end their life at the moment and manner of their choosing? To answer this argument, I think I would wish to speak about the limits of autonomy, which we already observe in society. I'm going to give you a slightly silly example, perhaps, but I think it helps to make the point. Take the example of a burglar who chooses to break into someone's house to steal someone's property. It's true that such a person is making a decision to shape their lives in a particular direction, exercising their autonomy, if you like, but this decision has a negative impact on the lives of the people whose property he has stolen. So autonomy has limits because human actions can have a much wider impact on communities and societies. Our right to do certain things is quite properly balanced against the common good. If a person asks for euthanasia and their wish is granted, it has an impact on the whole of society. The doctor who performs the act, for example, is no longer simply a professional who heals, but one who also kills. And surely this has wide impact for the nature of doctor-patient relationships, which are founded on trust. If the doctor changes from being someone who heals to someone who can also deliberately end your life, this becomes a very different relationship indeed. And at the level of wider society, the fact that patients who are sick are killed rather than cared for surely sends out a wider message that their lives perhaps are not worth living. And rather than relieving suffering in society, this is surely just another source of fear and suffering, reinforcing the idea that we don't have inherent value and dignity and that we might be better off dead. So what I've given you, I realize, is a very quick outline indeed of the beginning and end of life, understood not simply from a theological point of view, but also from a biological and philosophical point of view. I hope to have given you a sense that the Catholic approach to the ethical issues at the beginning and end of life makes sense and is inclusive and just, offering equal protection to all human persons, regardless of their developmental stage or sickness or disabilities. I realize that during my talk I will have missed out on certain aspects of the topic that you might have wanted to hear about. So please don't be afraid to bring those to me in your questions after the break. Thank you.